So we began this new series last week. It's called From Bondage to Freedom. And we were following along with Moses and the children of Israel as they moved from a place of slavery and bondage to a place of freedom. And there was a question that I asked you last week as we got started. It's a question that I'm going to ask you every week. And I want you to begin to think about it, not just when you're here, but think about it when you're at home, when you're at work, when you're in between. The question was something like this: what would it look like? What would it feel like if I were totally free? Free from the bondage of my fear that I've lived with for years. What would it look like if that no longer existed? What would it look like if I were no longer angry, enslaved to the things that had formed inside of me, and my anger had now turned to bitterness over the years? What would it look like if I were actually freed from that? What would it look like if I were free from the need to please others or have their approval? Some of us have been trying to please others for the better part of our lives. What would it look like if I were actually free from that? What would it look like if I were free from my addictions to food, to alcohol, to drugs, to sex? What would it look like if I were free? What would it feel like? I want you to think about that, because this is the journey we are on. It is a journey from being in a place of bondage to a place of freedom. That's how God made us, and that's how He wants us to be. He wants us to be free. Free to be our best self, to enjoy life and life to the full. But along the way, there are things that come into our worlds, our personal worlds, and before we know it, enslave us. They trap us. They keep us from being really and knowing the best life. And so what I wanted you to do on the front end of our time together is I wanted you to get a mental picture of what it would like to be a free person. Because there are many of us, while we are not wearing chains, while we are not physically imprisoned, we are mentally and emotionally and spiritually imprisoned. And we've been living that way for a long time. There are many of us who can't hardly imagine what it would look like not to be free, because we're afraid all the time. There are many of us who can imagine what it would be like, to feel like, to not be angry anymore, to just have that gone. Or just this compulsion to have the approval of others, or to have to control everything in our personal worlds. What would it be like if I didn't have to control all the events of my life? Last week we began the series by looking at Moses. And Moses grew up with a lot of anger. He bounced back and forth between the Hebrew and the Egyptian world. He was raised by his mom. He was given up and then raised by the Pharaoh's daughter. And he bounced back and forth for a period of time. And he was really having, on some level, this is my interpretation, some level of identity crisis. He was frustrated by his circumstances and situations. He never felt comfortable in either world. And so his frustration turned to anger, and his anger turned to violence, and he ultimately killed someone, Moses. And then when people found out and Pharaoh put a hit on him, he fled and ran away to a distant country, basically a wilderness area, Midian, where he would spend 40 years basically in solitude as a shepherd. Moses, when he was a young man, had a very special call on his life, but there was this interrupted period where he needed to go to a quiet place and get in touch with those patterns that were governing his life, those things that were enslaving him. And one day he happens upon a bush that was burning as he's tending to his flock. And I asked the question, I wonder how long the bush had been burning before he noticed. And I ask you, I wonder how many burning bushes you've passed because you've been so caught up in things that have enslaved you that you can't hear the voice of God or see His activity in your life, even though He is very, really present to you every day, all the time. Well, Moses has this great encounter, and God calls to him. He says, Moses, I know you're frustrated and confused about who you are, but I'm not confused about who you are. This is who I am. And then God begins to explain who who he is. And then he said, this is who you are. And he begins to tell him who he is. And then he calls him out of his bondage to a place of freedom. He calls him to a new place. He is going to be the liberator of his entire people, the children of Israel. Now, we didn't talk about it. We finished before we get into what Moses' response to God was. But you might imagine if you've been struggling with an identity crisis and you left Midian, left Egypt totally afraid and totally angry, that there might be some things that are confusing to you when God calls you to something great. So when God says to him, I want you to go, and I want you to go back to Egypt and approach the Pharaoh and tell him that the God of Abraham, Yahweh, said to let my people go. Moses didn't know this God. Moses was more familiar with the Egyptian gods than he was with the Hebrew God. So this encounter was the beginning of a relationship that was being forged between the two. So you might imagine that Moses was not all that excited to take on the role, right? He's going to go to the most powerful man in the world and tell him, okay, I want all of your slave labor to be released. The economy would crumble. It was built on the backs of the Israelites. So when you go to this taskmaster, this harsh leader, and you say, I've got a word from another God you don't know, and he wants you to release all of your slave labor, what do you think the result's going to be from the Pharaoh? What do you think he's going to say? Sure, no problem, go right ahead. Take them all. Is there anything else I can help you with? So Moses is reluctant, to say the least. And he begins to make excuses about why he isn't the guy for the job. And I would imagine that there are many of us who have been in that place where we have made excuses about why we're not the right person for the job when God speaks to, prompts, leads, or encounters us in some real way. So God starts to give him all sorts of signs and wonders. He begins to tell him, listen, throw your staff down. The staff turns into a snake. Put your hand in your coat, and he pulls it out and it's leprous. Put it back in. Pull it out. It's clean. He starts to give him all these things, like, it's not going to happen because you're eloquent. And by the way, Moses isn't. He's a stutterer. And so he says, well, I'm slow of speech. I'm not the right guy. He makes all these excuses. And God says, yeah, but it's not you who's going to be doing it. I choose you to be the tool of my liberation for these people. The question is, are you going to stay here in your bondage, or are you going to use what I'm giving you to be free and to help others be free? And so they wrangled back and forth for a while. Eventually, with a lot of encouragement from God and a little help from his brother Aaron, Moses goes and they approach the Pharaoh. And this is chapters 4 through chapters 12 of Exodus. And we're not going to cover that part, but I do want you to read that so that you can stay in touch with the story. This is when all the plagues broke out, right? Every day he goes to the Pharaoh. The Pharaoh doesn't want anything to do with it. Different signs, different wonders. Finally, on the last day, with the final plague, the Pharaoh allows the children of Israel to leave. And leave they will. They will get out of Dodge as quickly as they can, and they are headed to a new place, a place called Canaan. It is the promised land. Now, Frank, if you can put for me, thank you, sir, that map. When they leave here, they want to get from right here, from green to green, okay? And the most natural route is right along the Mediterranean. It's the quickest, fastest, most scenic route. It's not going to be the route they take. Okay? God will not have them take the scenic, quick route. He's going to have them take the roundabout way. And where you find the story is in Exodus chapter 13. Exodus chapter 13, beginning in verse 17. Just going to read a few verses to get us started. When Pharaoh finally let the people go, God did not lead them along the main road that runs through the Philistine territory, even though that was the shortest route to the Promised Land. God said, if the people are faced with a battle, they might change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led them in a roundabout way through the wilderness toward the Red Sea. Okay? This trip, if you were to take it, right here, this quick route, is about 200 miles as the crow flies. It should take them about 2 weeks. So God decides that He is not going to take them this way. He is going to take them crossing the Red Sea. Now again, they're going from green to green. As it gets more dark brown, that's deeper wilderness. He's going to take them south into the wilderness. This doesn't seem like a good way, does it? If I'm trying to get from there to there, this is not crossing a sea and then down into a wilderness and up and around the best way. Would you choose that way? I would never choose that way. But God chooses that way. And why does He choose that way? It's really, really, really important for us to get this. Because there are going to be times in our lives where God leads us in a wilderness-like way, and we're going to ask the question, why would you do this to me, God? Why would you do this to me? And we're going to be tempted to think that we've done something wrong. We're going to be tempted to think that God is punishing us. We're going to be tempted to think that this is because of all the bad things that we've done, and so we are somehow moving into this place that we deserve. And if we don't deserve it, then we're going to get angry with God that He isn't nicer to us than what He is. But I want you to imagine, as you think about the people who are leaving now, these Israelites, what they were like when they were called from their bondage to a new place of freedom. If you will remember, they and their parents and their parents and their parents for about 10 generations had been slaves. So when you are enslaved for 400 years, one would think that your life has largely been governed by fear. Because your harsh, cruel taskmasters beat you, they chain you, they expect more from you than you're able or willing to give. And this goes on and on and on. And so when they are released, they are not a mighty army. They are not a well-formed people. They don't even know the God who has delivered them. They've been living in Egypt for 400 years. They are not familiar with Yahweh. And so it's the wilderness where God is going to introduce Himself to them. Now we oftentimes want to take the quickest route, right? When we're set free, we want to be free. The problem is we're not ready to inhabit the land of promise. There are some things that need to transpire in us before we can be people who live free. Many of us, when we're first set free, and the thought of being free is exciting, but we think since we are, then life should look and feel a certain way. And then we set up expectations about what God should do or will do. And when it doesn't happen, we grow greatly disappointed. This will be no different than the children of Israel experienced. But there is a process when you are being free from bondage before it actually takes. Before you actually believe it yourself. Could God have delivered them? It was called the way of the Philistines. They would have to travel through enemy territory. And it was a mighty army of people. And they were very, very, very dastardly. They were very cruel and vicious, and they were very well trained. So it wasn't that God couldn't deliver them on the 200-mile trek. It was that He knew that they were still people who were largely governed by fear. And if left to their own devices, they would return back to where they came from. And some of us face that often. When faced with fear and caused to make a decision to move forward, we will oftentimes go back to what we know, even if it is fear, anger, need to please others, even if it is to a place of slavery. God knows better. He knows them. So the first reason that God leads them on the roundabout way is to actually spare them. He leads them into the wilderness as an act of compassion, as an act of mercy. They were not a well-trained army. They were not ready for the battle. They were going to need to encounter Him in real life-altering ways, so that when they finally hit that place, and they were going to be confronted with whether or not to move forward or to move back, they were going to know that their God was able to deliver them. And this is what's going to make up the rest of the book of Exodus, as God reveals himself and proves himself to them over and over and over again. They didn't know God. And so he was going to take them on a roundabout way. This, by the way, is not a minor detour. Okay, right? The initial route, 200 miles, 2 weeks. We remember how long the detour takes? 40 years. Are you kidding me? 40 years. And there would be an entire generation of people who would die out because they were not able to move from their chains to freedom. They would have to, because they couldn't express faith, they would have to die in the wilderness place. And sometimes in the wilderness place, things die. But sometimes in the wilderness place, things grow. And for those who are willing to enter into and to encounter God and experience his power and to move forward in faith, you will see that life in a very real way changes for the better. The first reason God led them on a roundabout way was to spare them. Now sometimes when you hit those hard, barren, difficult places in your life, you can't see it, and neither could they. But it may well be that it's God's gift to you. He might be sparing you from a greater harm if you would have gotten what you wanted. Sometimes God leads us by the way of the wilderness, not because he's angry with us, but because he's sparing us. You say, well, it doesn't really feel like that to me. When I'm in a hard place, a difficult place, a place I don't want to be, a bleak place, it doesn't really feel like to me that this is some gift from God. It feels more like punishment. And I'm just going to say to you, sometimes what you see and sometimes what is are two different things. Thus the need for a little bit of faith in the God who will reveal himself to you as you open yourself to him. I think the first reason he led them on a roundabout way was to spare them. But he didn't only do that to spare them. I think he also led them to the wilderness place so that he would shape them, so that he could grow them. You know, it took the children of Israel one night to get out of Egypt. But it took them almost 400 years to get Egypt out of them. And sometimes when we've been enslaved to patterns in our lives that have existed since we can't even remember, sometimes it takes us a while to be ready to be free. God leads them to a place of wilderness so that at some point, as he reveals himself to them, he can grow them into a place of maturity. You only learn to grow in faith by being given the opportunities to extend it. Most of us would spend our days controlling the places in our lives, dictating the plans, leading us to the places that we want to go, and we would want to get there faster than we do. One of the most irritating qualities about God is that he's not in any hurry to get us to where we want to be. And the reason that he isn't is because he's far more concerned with who we are becoming than where we're going. He doesn't seem to care how long it takes us to get there. What he really cares is about who we're becoming along the way. Some of the people had to die out. They could not inhabit a place of freedom. He offered them this new place, a better life, a better way. Some would be able to receive it, others would not. Exodus teaches us over and over, God's not in a hurry. So maybe you shouldn't be either. Maybe rather than getting what you want as soon as you want it, maybe what you can think about is maybe just maybe God has me in this place that I least want to be, this place that I keep begging to get out of. Maybe he has me here to teach me something about myself and about himself. If you're confused like Moses about your identity, if you've been led by patterns that are sometimes unconscious and sometimes conscious in your life that have enslaved you for some time, it may well be that you're in the place that you are so that you can learn something about those patterns and not try to fix or change yourself, but just to let go of them. We cling to our chains, some of us, because they're familiar, but they enslave us. And they keep us from being who God wants us to be. And so perhaps God has us in this very place that we are for a very real purpose. When I was younger in my faith, I used to always, when I prayed, and if I was in a stuck place or a place I didn't want to be, I used to always ask God to deliver me from it, to remove, to get me out. And I don't pray that prayer so much anymore, although I feel like I want to. Now I just ask God to join me in it and show me what he needs me to see. So that when he's ready to lead me out, I'll be ready to go. Some of us have been begging God to take us out of the place we are. And maybe we should be asking God, what is it that you want me to know? What is it that you want me to say? Because while we might make a confession that Jesus is Lord, really what leads us is fear. Really what leads us is our need for control. Really what leads us is our need for approval. Really what leads us are our addictions to things that are stronger than us. And really what God wants us to see is that if you're going to allow me to lead you into a new place, you've got to let go of those old things. Because I'm not going to battle for your heart with those things. You're going to have to choose me. And when you choose me, I will lead you. God sometimes leads us to the hard places to spare us. And he sometimes leads us to the hard places to shape us. And it might well be, as you find yourself logging some time in the desert, and by the way, any person of faith, you can just walk through the scriptures and see. If you're a person of faith at all, you're going to log some time in the desert. David did. Daniel did. Joseph did. And you know what? By and large, it wasn't because of anything they did wrong. It was because God was trying to show himself to them, and to provide for them, and to care for them in a new way. And that's what he wants to do for us. I think sometimes when we can't see something, it causes us to be confused. And then we wonder if God's character is still intact, if God is still who God said he was. Sometimes it just takes us a while on our journey to get to know God. And then to trust God. Because there's a big gap between believing in God and trusting in God. And the only way to be trusting God is by getting on the journey and putting one foot in front of the other and allowing him to guide you, allowing him to lead you. You know, when the Israelites leave and he takes them south on the roundabout way, one of the first things they encounter is what? The Red Sea. He's going to take them right to the foot of the Red Sea. They're going to be faced with this vast expanse. They've never seen before that this thing can open up. They think they're going to be swallowed up. Do you think they're afraid? Of course they are. They've been afraid their whole life. Why would this moment be any different? God's showing them, you don't have to be afraid anymore. I can put you right in front of the greatest obstacle you will think you will ever have in your life. But let me lead you. Don't let fear. Let me lead you. And as they do, they will find that the sea opens up and they walk right through, and their enemies come behind them, and the sea closes in on them. God is with them and for them. I want to read you one final piece to the story in chapter 13, because it's a thought I want you to leave with. It's an important one. We pick the story back up in chapter 13. God leads them in a roundabout way. Verse 20, it says, the Israelites left Sukkot, and they camped at Etham on the edge of the wilderness. The Lord went ahead of them. He guided them during the day with a pillar of cloud, and he provided light at night with a pillar of fire. This allowed them to travel by day or by night. And the Lord did not remove the pillar of cloud or pillar of fire from its place in front of the people. However threatening or difficult or conflicted their journey was, they were always in the presence of God, day or night. That's an important point for you not to miss. However conflicted or disturbing or confusing your journey is, you are always in the presence of God. And that's going to be important for you, because as you continue your journey of faith, you're going to face many obstacles. And really the question is going to be, are you going to move forward towards promise, or are you going to go back to what's familiar? You know going backwards is a move towards death. You know going backwards is to become enslaved all over again. You know it's wrong. But sometimes when you've been led by spirits of a different kind for the better part of your life, it just seems easier to go back. Doesn't it? And I'm just saying to you, on your journey, no matter how confusing or difficult or trying it gets, Exodus 13 teaches us God is always there, day and night. And if you cry out to him, if you avail yourself to him, the book teaches us that he will show up. And he will minister to you in the place that you most deeply need to be ministered to. Will he take you on the shortest route? Always no. Most often, God doesn't take us on the quickest, easiest routes. If we were taken on the quickest, easiest routes, we would miss every interaction in between that we need to help us become people of faith. So if you're looking for a quick, easy route, a scenic route, by the way of the Mediterranean, you've probably come to the wrong place. But if you want the best route, if you want the route that takes you by way of the wilderness, the roundabout way, but a way in which God will always be there with you and for you, providing for you in the places that you most need, then I invite you to join me on this journey. Because my hope for us as a people, as we walk through and look at the book of Exodus and the lives of the children of Israel, is that we will learn some things that in a very deep and meaningful and personal way will help to liberate us from our own bondage. What would it look like? What would it feel like if I were actually free? I want, by the time we're finished, for you to so have a picture of that you couldn't possibly think about going back. Because what's in front of you is so far surpassing that which is behind you, that no matter how difficult it gets, and no matter how many obstacles are in front of you, you are going forward. That's what I want for us as a people of faith. And as we join together, there's strength in numbers. So we want to do this journey together, not alone. Okay? God doesn't have you in a hard place because he's trying to punish you. He may well have you in a hard place because he's trying to grow you. Because he's sparing you from something worse that you couldn't have possibly seen. But if you begin to trust him, you will begin to see his fingerprints in your life all along the way. That's why last week, if you were here, I gave you some homework. I said I would love for you to go and carve out some solitude in your life. Moses needed about 40 years before he was ready to move into a new place. Solitude is that place in our lives where we turn aside for the purpose of encountering the bush. Because the bush is burning all the time. It's just, we don't often have the time and the intentionality to hear or see it. Now listen, I'm not going to ask you, did you do your homework? Because it's not for me, it's for you. The homework's for you. It's not even for God. You don't get brownie points for doing homework at church, right? It's for you. When we become honest enough to be our full self in the presence of God, then we can let go of the patterns that have been guiding us for most of our lives. Just let it go. Solitude is not a place to fix or change ourselves. It's a place to let go. It's a place to encounter the things that are the worst in us and to release our need for them to lead us. So I want to continue to invite you. That's what the wilderness is. The wilderness is going to be a place where, like Moses had his Midian, Moses is now going to lead them into their own Midian, which is the Sinai Desert. And they're going to have some of that too, because they've been slaves for as long as they can remember. They don't even know God yet. But by the time they get done, they will be a mighty army, well-trained, fully prepared, ready to go and enter the place of promise, the place that God intended for them from the very start. And I want that for you. So as you think about that, let's pray. Lord, we want to be free. So we open ourselves to the roundabout way, and we are going to trust you in this next step that we take. And however confusing and difficult and barren it might feel, we pray this day that we will not turn back. We want your best, and we ask you to guide us now, not fear. We ask you to guide us, not anger. We ask you to guide us, not approval. We ask you to guide us, not addiction. We ask you to guide us, Lord. Lead us to the place you want us to be and shape us into the people that you made us to be. And in advance, we'll give